In 1924, four deaf brothers developed the ability to communicate telepathically across impossible distances, and then they vanished during a government experiment that was supposed to be therapy. Picture this: James, Samuel, Thomas, and William Miller, born into the silence of deafness, somehow transcended every limitation science said was absolute. They could sense each other's pain from separate buildings, predict events they couldn't see or hear, and according to classified documents that weren't supposed to exist, they may have unlocked secrets about human consciousness that certain people would kill to keep hidden. This happened in rural Pennsylvania, at the height of America's post-war optimism, when families trusted institutions and questioning authority was unthinkable. The Whitmore Institute for Children with Special Needs promised to help these unfortunate boys adapt to society. Instead, Dr. Cornelius Whitmore used them as test subjects in experiments that violated every ethical boundary, experiments that may have worked exactly as intended. 4 innocent children entered that facility in March 1924. By June, they had developed abilities that challenged everything we think we know about the limits of human potential. And then, during the final experiment designed to amplify their telepathic connection, they simply disappeared. What makes this case impossible to dismiss is the paper trail. Government documents that prove federal agencies didn't just know about these experiments, they funded them. We're talking about classified research programs that continued for decades after the boys vanished, suggesting that what happened to the Miller quadruplets wasn't an accident or a tragedy, it was a successful test run. And here's what'll keep you up at night. Credible sightings of 4 identical men, now in their hundreds, continue to this day, with witnesses reporting that they retain their supernatural abilities and seem to be recruiting others. This channel isn't for everyone. If you need your reality comfortable and your mysteries solved with neat explanations, you might want to look elsewhere. But if you're ready to question what they've told us is possible, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you rewatching from, because what I'm about to reveal about the Miller quadruplets will change how you think about the hidden capabilities of the human mind forever. If mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the human mind fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to discover will make you question the very nature of consciousness itself. The story I'm sharing today involves government cover-ups, classified experiments, and abilities that science still can't explain, so you'll want to make sure you don't miss any of our deep dives into cases the authorities would prefer stayed buried. The Whitmore Institute for Children with Special Needs stood as a monument to progressive thinking in 1920s America, positioned as a beacon of hope for families struggling with children who didn't fit society's narrow definitions of normal. Founded by Dr. Cornelius Whitmore in 1898, this imposing facility in rural Pennsylvania marketed itself as a pioneer in what they called consciousness rehabilitation therapy, methods that went far beyond conventional medicine into territories that modern ethics would consider absolutely forbidden. While other institutions focused on containment and control, Whitmore promised transformation, claiming he could unlock hidden potentials in children that mainstream medicine had written off as hopeless cases. What families didn't know was that their children were becoming test subjects in experiments that pushed the boundaries of what human beings were capable of experiencing. This investigation became possible only because of a remarkable stroke of luck that occurred in 2019, when the abandoned Whitmore Institute was finally sold at a county auction after decades of legal battles over the property. Among the items discovered during the estate sale were 3 trunks of documents that had somehow escaped the systematic destruction of records that followed the facility's closure in 1924. These papers, patient files, experimental logs, correspondence with unnamed government officials, and Dr. Whitmore's own encrypted research journals had been hidden in a sealed room behind the Institute's library for nearly a century. The woman who purchased these trunks at the auction, thinking they contained old books, instead found herself in possession of evidence that several federal agencies had spent decades trying to suppress. Before we dive into this rabbit hole of classified experiments and impossible phenomena, I want to hear from our global community of truth seekers. Drop a comment and let me know what country you're watching from, because this investigation has attracted attention from researchers and government whistleblowers across 6 continents, and I'm curious to see how far our network of investigators extends. Now, let's begin with 4 brothers who were born into a world of silence, but somehow learned to communicate in ways that defied every law of physics we thought was absolute. The autumn of 1919 painted the Miller farmstead in hues of gold and crimson, but beneath the pastoral beauty of rural Pennsylvania lay something that defied every law of nature the locals thought they understood. According to county birth records dated October 13, 1919, Sarah Miller delivered 4 identical boys in a grueling 18-hour labor that nearly claimed her life. The attending physician, Dr. Edmund Hayes, noted in his meticulously kept journal that he'd never witnessed such an unusual birth, not just because quadruplets were extraordinarily rare, but because all 4 infants were born completely deaf, a medical anomaly that occurred in less than 1% of such multiple births. James, Samuel, Thomas, and William Miller grew up in a world of silence, yet their behavior suggested they lived in anything but isolation. Their father, Ezekiel Miller, a weathered farmer whose family had worked the same 200 acres for 3 generations, first documented the boy's peculiar synchronization in letters he wrote to his brother in Pittsburgh. "They move like one mind split into 4 bodies," he wrote in the winter of 1922. "When one gets hurt, they all cry. When one's hungry, they all come running to the kitchen." What Ezekiel didn't mention, not until much later, was how the boys would sometimes stop their play simultaneously, turn toward the eastern horizon, and point at something no one else could see. The incidents that would eventually lead to their removal began small but grew increasingly disturbing as the quadruplets approached their 5th birthday. According to testimony given to the Pennsylvania State Police in March 1924, the boys had begun displaying what neighbors euphemistically called unusual awareness. Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw, who lived on the adjacent property, swore in a sworn affidavit that she'd seen all 4 boys run to their front gate a full 10 minutes before the mail carrier's wagon appeared on the distant road. More troubling were the reports from the local church, where Reverend Marcus Thompson recorded in parish records that the Miller boys would become agitated during services, pointing and gesturing frantically at empty pews where, he later discovered, recently deceased parishioners used to sit. The final straw came on a bitterly cold February morning in 1924, when all 4 boys awakened, screaming at exactly 3:17 a.m. Their parents found them huddled together, pointing toward the Henshaw property and making the urgent hand gestures they used to communicate with each other. At dawn, a search party discovered that Mrs. Henshaw's prize bull had broken through the ice on Miller's Pond and drowned at precisely 3:17 a.m., according to the county coroner's estimated time of death. What the Miller family couldn't explain was how 4 deaf children, sleeping in a closed room a quarter-mile away, had known about a tragedy they couldn't possibly have heard, seen, or sensed. But what they discovered 3 days later would make this incident seem like child's play. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore's imposing figure cast long shadows through the marble corridors of the Whitmore Institute for Children with Special Needs, a fortress-like structure that had been erected in 1898 on 47 acres of isolated Pennsylvania countryside. According to the Philadelphia Medical Journal's 1923 winter edition, Whitmore was considered a pioneer in what he termed consciousness expansion therapy, though his colleagues whispered about methods that bordered on the unethical. The 3-story brick building, with its barred windows and separate wings for different classifications of children, had been designed by architect Harrison Blackwood specifically to facilitate Whitmore's experimental programs. County records show the institute received substantial funding not just from wealthy philanthropists, but from a series of anonymous donors whose contributions were channeled through a Washington, D.C. law firm that specialized in government contracts. Whitmore himself was an enigma wrapped in academic credentials and troubling rumors. Born in 1871 to a family of prominent Boston physicians, he'd studied at Harvard Medical School before spending 3 controversial years in Vienna, where he'd worked alongside early practitioners of psychological manipulation techniques. His medical license, according to Pennsylvania State Board records, had been suspended twice, once in 1915 for unauthorized experimentation on minors, and again in 1921 for employing methods not recognized by conventional medical practice. Yet somehow the Whitmore Institute continued to operate and expand, accepting children from across the northeastern United States whose families were either too poor to ask questions or too desperate for help to look too closely at the Institute's methods. The Institute's treatment protocols, as outlined in Whitmore's own clinical notes discovered decades later, involved what he called sensory recalibration therapy. Children were placed in specially constructed isolation chambers, windowless rooms lined with cork and felt, for periods ranging from several hours to several days. According to testimony from former staff member Ruth Kellerman, given to state investigators in 1962, children would emerge from these sessions different somehow, like they were listening to sounds the rest of us couldn't hear. More disturbing were Whitmore's detailed logs describing experiments in psychic conductivity, where children with similar conditions were placed in separate rooms and subjected to various stimuli to test what he termed non-local consciousness responses. The Institute's basement contained a series of cells, though Whitmore preferred the term meditation chambers, that were completely soundproofed and painted black. Previous cases documented in Whitmore's personal files revealed a pattern that should have raised red flags with authorities, if those authorities hadn't been so mysteriously inclined to look the other way. 7-year-old Margaret Poole, admitted in 1920 for what her family called strange visions, had reportedly developed the ability to predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy before disappearing during a routine treatment session in 1922. Twin brothers Peter and Paul Nash, both diagnosed with what was then called mental deficiency, had allegedly begun communicating telepathically during their stay before their case files were mysteriously sealed by court order. Most troubling of all was the case of young Elizabeth Crane, whose parents had sent her to the Institute after she began speaking in languages she never learned. According to encrypted notes found in Whitmore's safe, she'd started predicting staff members' actions days before they occurred. But when the Miller Quadruplets arrived in March 1924, even Whitmore seemed unprepared for what his experiments would unleash. The first documented evidence of the Miller Quadruplets' impossible abilities appeared in Dr. Whitmore's research journal on March 15, 1924, just 2 days after their arrival at the Institute. According to his meticulously detailed notes, written in the cramped handwriting that characterized his most sensitive observations, the 4 boys had been placed in separate rooms on different floors of the East Wing for initial evaluation. At exactly 2:47 p.m., all 4 children simultaneously began making identical hand gestures. Not the crude sign language their parents had described, but complex flowing movements that seemed to follow an intricate pattern none of the staff had ever witnessed. What made this discovery truly unsettling was that the boys had no visual contact with each other. James was in the basement isolation chamber, Samuel in a second-floor observation room, while Thomas and William occupied separate cells on the 3rd floor, each room separated by thick stone walls and heavy oak doors. Nurse Adelaide Morrison, whose employment records show she'd worked at the Institute for 6 years without incident, documented what happened next in a report that would later be classified and sealed by federal authorities. During the boys' first meal in the Institute's cafeteria, served in a windowless room under the supervision of 3 staff members, the quadruplets began exhibiting what Morrison described as synchronized distress responses. Without any apparent trigger, all 4 boys suddenly stopped eating and began pointing frantically toward the Institute's north wall. Their agitation grew so intense that they had to be physically restrained, their silent screams echoing through the corridors as they struggled against their handlers. Morrison noted that this episode lasted exactly 11 minutes, ending as abruptly as it had begun, when all four boys simultaneously relaxed and returned to their meal as if nothing had occurred. The truth behind their behavior became clear the following morning when groundskeeper Harold Brennan discovered the mutilated remains of 3 local farm animals, 2 sheep and a cow, arranged in a precise triangle formation in the woods exactly 200 yards north of the Institute, in the precise direction the boys had been pointing. According to Brennan's sworn statement to the Pennsylvania State Police, the animals had been killed and positioned sometime between 2:30 and 3 a.m., their blood forming strange geometric patterns in the snow that defied explanation. More disturbing was the coroner's finding that the animals showed no signs of struggle, as if they had willingly participated in their own ritualistic slaughter. Dr. Whitmore's private notes, discovered during the 1967 investigation, reveal his growing excitement about what he termed the boys' extrasensory perception capabilities, but they also hint at his increasing concern about phenomena he was beginning to realize he couldn't control. The Institute staff began reporting increasingly bizarre incidents involving the Miller quadruplets throughout the spring of 1924. Kitchen worker Martha Delacroix told investigators that she would often find the boys standing at their cell doors minutes before mealtimes, even though no bells had been rung and no announcements made. Groundskeeper Brennan noted that the boys could somehow sense his approach to their building from distances of over 100 yards, gathering at windows and doorways long before he became visible. Most unsettling of all were the reports from night watchman Theodore Walsh, whose security logs document multiple instances of finding all 4 boys awake at precisely the same moment, during random checks, staring in the same direction with expressions he described as knowing and ancient, like they were seeing things that happened long ago or far away. But it was during the final series of experiments that Dr. Whitmore would discover just how deep the rabbit hole of the quadruplets' abilities actually went, and why some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. The week of June 9, 1924, marked what Dr. Whitmore's encrypted research logs would later reveal as Phase 3 of his experiments with the Miller quadruplets. According to testimony from surviving staff member Edgar Thornfield, given during closed-door congressional hearings in 1952, Whitmore had become obsessed with what he called the boys' collective consciousness matrix. The doctor had installed a series of copper wires and electrical apparatus in the Institute's basement laboratory, equipment that had arrived in unmarked crates from a Philadelphia manufacturing company with known ties to military research contracts. Thornfield described sessions where the quadruplets were connected to this machinery via electrodes placed on their temples and wrists, their vital signs monitored as Whitmore subjected them to increasingly intense electrical stimulations designed to amplify their natural telepathic conductivity. The final documented experiment took place on the evening of June 13th, a Friday that would be remembered by the Institute staff as the night everything went wrong. According to Dr. Whitmore's own notes, discovered hidden behind a false wall in his office 30 years later, he had decided to test what he termed long-distance psychic projection by separating the boys not just by rooms, but by substantial physical distances. James was kept in the basement laboratory. Samuel was transported to a specially prepared chamber in the Institute's North Tower. Thomas was secured in an underground tunnel that connected the main building to the old carriage house, and William was placed in a sensory deprivation tank that had been installed in the Institute's East Wing. Each boy was connected to monitoring equipment that tracked their brain activity, heart rate, and what Whitmore mysteriously referred to as psychic field fluctuations. At exactly 11:47 p.m., according to multiple witness accounts and the Institute's official incident report, a power surge caused every electrical device in the building to either malfunction or emit sounds that staff described as inhuman screaming. Night nurse Patricia Caldwell, whose sanity would never fully recover from what she witnessed, reported that all monitoring equipment connected to the Miller boys began registering readings that shouldn't have been possible from human subjects. The copper wiring throughout the basement laboratory allegedly began glowing with a pale blue light, and several staff members reported hearing what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, though no words could be distinguished. Security guard Raymond Morris, making his rounds in the main corridor, documented that every locked door in the institute somehow opened simultaneously. At 11:52 p.m., as if some invisible force had passed through the building, unlocking everything in its path. When dawn broke on June 14, 1924, the Miller quadruplets were gone. Their individual holding areas showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. In fact, the rooms appeared exactly as they had been left, with beds still made and personal belongings untouched. More mysteriously, the monitoring equipment attached to each boy had simply stopped functioning at 11:52 p.m., the exact moment the doors had opened, with no recorded indication of the devices being removed or damaged. Dr. Whitmore's initial report to local authorities claimed the boys had somehow coordinated an escape, but his private notes told a different story, describing phenomena that transcend current scientific understanding and expressing fear about forces we may have inadvertently unleashed. The Institute's official position would change several times over the following days, but what remained constant was the systematic destruction of evidence and the mysterious deaths of 3 staff members who had been present during the final experiment. What investigators would discover about the cover-up would prove that some secrets were deemed too dangerous for the public to ever learn. The official investigation into the Miller quadruplets' disappearance began on June 16, 1924, under the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania State Police Detective Captain Walter Morrison, whose initial report painted a picture of bureaucratic incompetence rather than supernatural phenomena. According to the case file, designated as PSP 1924-0847 and declassified only in 1994, Morrison's team found evidence of negligent supervision, resulting in the escape of 4 institutionalized minors. The report concluded that the boys had exploited a security weakness during the night shift change and simply walked away from the facility. However, Morrison's personal diary, discovered after his death in 1967, told a radically different story. "What I saw in that basement laboratory," he wrote in an entry dated June 18, 1924, "defies every rational explanation I've encountered in 20 years of police work. The copper wiring had been twisted into shapes that seemed to hurt your eyes to look at, and there were scorch marks on the walls that formed patterns I pray I never see again." The discrepancies between public statements and private documentation became even more pronounced when federal authorities arrived at the scene 3 days after the disappearance. Agent Harrison Cole of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation led a team of specialists whose credentials, according to FBI archives released under the Freedom of Information Act, included backgrounds in unconventional research and anomalous phenomena investigation. Cole's team spent 6 weeks at the Whitmore Institute, interviewing staff, examining evidence, and conducting what witnesses described as experiments of their own in the basement laboratory. Local newspaper coverage of the investigation ceased abruptly after the first week, with editors later claiming they had been advised that continued reporting would not serve the public interest. The Pittsburgh Herald's final article on the case, published on June 23rd, contained only a brief statement that the missing boys were presumed to have drowned in a nearby river, despite the fact that no bodies were ever found, and several witnesses reported seeing footprints leading away from the institute in the opposite direction of any water source. Dr. Whitmore himself became increasingly erratic following the incident, his behavior documented in letters from concerned colleagues and family members. According to correspondence found in the archives of the American Medical Association, Whitmore began claiming that his experiments had opened doorways that should have remained closed and that the Miller boys had not escaped, but had been translated to a different plane of existence. His research notes from this period, written in an increasingly illegible hand, described visions of the quadruplets appearing to him in dreams, warning him about others who would seek to exploit what we had discovered. On September 3, 1924, Whitmore was found dead in his laboratory, officially ruled a suicide by carbolic acid poisoning, though several details of the scene troubled investigators. The laboratory had been stripped bare of all equipment, with no trace of the mysterious copper apparatus that multiple witnesses had described, and Whitmore's body was positioned in a manner that suggested he had been trying to reach something just beyond his grasp. The systematic suppression of evidence became apparent in the months following Whitmore's death, as key witnesses began disappearing or dying under suspicious circumstances. Night nurse Patricia Caldwell was committed to a psychiatric institution after claiming she continued to see the Miller boys moving through the walls like ghosts, and died there 6 months later from what was listed as a heart attack, despite being only 28 years old and in perfect health. Security guard Raymond Morris relocated to California and died in a car accident in 1925, just days before a private investigator hired by the Miller family was scheduled to interview him. Most troubling was the fate of groundskeeper Harold Brennan, whose family reported him missing in October 1924, after he began telling neighbors about strange men in suits who had been asking questions about the night the quadruplets vanished. His body was never found, but his personal effects were discovered in his cabin, along with a note in handwriting that didn't match his own, stating simply, "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." What investigators would later uncover about government interest in psychic research during this period would suggest that the Miller quadruplets had stumbled into something far more significant than anyone had realized. The first breakthrough in the Miller quadruplets case came in 1978, when the Central Intelligence Agency's declassification of documents related to Project Stargate revealed references to the Pennsylvania subjects and quadruple telepathic phenomena observed in 1924. According to these heavily redacted files, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by paranormal researcher Dr. Margaret Thornwell, the CIA had maintained active interest in the Whitmore Institute case for over 50 years. The documents reference a classified program called Operation Mindbridge, which had allegedly been established in 1925 to investigate and potentially replicate the conditions that led to the Miller boys' unusual abilities. More disturbing were references to successful contact protocols and ongoing monitoring of displaced subjects, suggesting that government agencies had not only known what happened to the quadruplets, but had been actively tracking them since their disappearance. Modern sightings of the Miller quadruplets began surfacing in the 1960s, though most were dismissed by authorities as hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity. However, FBI files released in 2001 documented at least 17 credible reports from witnesses across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia describing encounters with 4 identical middle-aged deaf men who moved and acted in perfect synchronization. The most compelling account came from Dr. Elizabeth Crane, a psychiatrist working at the West Virginia State Hospital, who reported in 1973 that 4 men matching the Miller description had appeared at the facility asking to visit patients in the psychiatric ward. According to Dr. Crane's detailed report, filed with both local police and federal authorities, the men somehow knew intimate details about patients they had never met, including childhood traumas and suppressed memories that weren't recorded in any official files. Security cameras from that day mysteriously malfunctioned, but several staff members confirmed the men's presence and their disturbing ability to calm even the most violent patients simply by making eye contact. Contemporary research into consciousness and quantum entanglement has provided new frameworks for understanding what might have happened to the Miller quadruplets. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, at Stanford University's Consciousness Studies Department, whose 2019 paper Quantum Consciousness and Non-Local Awareness was published in The Journal of Theoretical Psychology has suggested that cases like the Miller boys represent natural examples of what she terms quantum-entangled consciousness. According to Dr. Morrison's research, funded partially by grants from undisclosed government sources, certain individuals may possess the ability to maintain conscious connections across vast distances through mechanisms that operate outside conventional space-time limitations. Her work, while controversial in mainstream scientific circles, has gained support from researchers studying similar phenomena in twins and other multiple birth siblings, particularly those who experience trauma or unusual circumstances during early development. The most recent evidence came to light in 2020, when construction workers renovating the abandoned Whitmore Institute discovered a hidden chamber beneath the original basement laboratory. According to archaeological reports filed with the Pennsylvania Historical Society, the chamber contained equipment that appeared to be a more advanced version of Dr. Whitmore's original apparatus, along with journals written in 4 different handwritings but expressing identical thoughts and observations. The journals, dated as recently as 2018, described ongoing experiments in consciousness expansion and contained detailed maps of locations across North America where similar phenomena had been observed. Most unsettling were the final entries, which spoke of preparing for the next phase and referenced others like us who are ready to transcend physical limitations. Federal agents arrived at the site within hours of the discovery, seizing all materials and classifying the findings under national security provisions that remain sealed to this day. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this discovery was the realization that if the journals were authentic, the Miller quadruplets had not only survived their ordeal, they had been continuing Dr. Whitmore's work for nearly a century, and they were no longer alone. The case of the Miller quadruplets forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of human consciousness and the lengths to which authorities will go to control information that challenges our understanding of reality. What began as a tragic story of 4 deaf children sent to an institution for help has revealed itself to be something far more significant. Evidence that human beings may possess latent abilities that certain organizations have been studying and exploiting for nearly a century. The implications extend far beyond one family's tragedy. They suggest that our entire conception of human limitations may be fundamentally flawed, and that those in power have known this for generations. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore died under suspicious circumstances in 1924, but his work clearly didn't die with him. The declassified documents we've examined today prove that government agencies continued researching consciousness expansion and telepathic phenomena well into the modern era, using the Miller case as a foundation for programs that remain classified to this day. As for the quadruplets themselves, if the recent sightings and the hidden journal entries are authentic, they've not only survived but evolved, spending the past century developing abilities that would make their childhood demonstrations seem primitive by comparison. The question isn't whether they're still out there. The evidence strongly suggests they are. The question is what they've become and what they're planning next. The impact on our understanding of human potential cannot be overstated. If 4 children born into silence could develop supernatural communication abilities through trauma and experimentation, what does that say about the dormant capabilities that might exist within all of us? Perhaps more troubling is the realization that institutions we trust, medical facilities, government agencies, research organizations, may be far more willing to exploit these capabilities than to help us understand them. The Miller family's tragedy became a stepping stone for programs designed not to heal or help, but to weaponize human consciousness itself. This raises profound questions about the nature of human evolution and the possibility that consciousness operates according to laws we haven't yet discovered, or that we've discovered and deliberately hidden from public knowledge. Are we on the verge of a new phase of human development, one where the boundaries between individual minds become permeable, and if so, who gets to control that evolution? The Miller quadruplets may have been early pioneers in a transformation that affects us all, willing or not. But here's what keeps me awake at night. The final entries in those hidden journals mentioned others like us who are ready to transcend physical limitations. If the Miller boys have been recruiting people with similar abilities for decades, how many others are out there? How many missing persons cases that we've written off as random tragedies might actually be connected to this ongoing experiment in human consciousness? And most disturbing of all, if they've been perfecting these abilities for a century, what are they capable of now? What do you think really happened to the Miller quadruplets? Do you believe human consciousness has limits we don't understand? Or is there a more conventional explanation for everything we've uncovered? Drop your theories in the comments below. This community of truth seekers has some of the most insightful perspectives I've ever encountered. If this investigation opened your eyes to possibilities you'd never considered, smash that like button and share this video with someone who isn't afraid to question official narratives. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because next week we're diving into another case that authorities have tried to bury, one that might be directly connected to what we've discovered about the Miller family. And remember, the truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth pursuing. Until next time, keep questioning. Everything they tell you is impossible.